prior to being in the textile industry, I was a product designer. And in a way, I experienced similar experience what happened in textile to overall manufacturing in the US. I worked for domestic manufacturing firms in the houseware industry, so dinnerware and decorative wear and so forth. And the factories started shutting down. So I had always had a passion for textiles. One of my early memories from childhood was going to a relative's house and seeing a tapestry loom in one of the rooms. And I didn't even know really what it was, but I had an immediate positive reaction to it. But harbored this like dread all my life, wanting to go into the arts ever since I was small. But what if I couldn't do it? What if I failed at textiles? So I did some weaving when I was in high school, very tiny little piece, and then went into product design. And then when that industry, I could see this writing on the wall, it was either work in a design studio, which was very tough at the time. It was still the 80s, not an easy place for women in product design. And so I said, I'm going to go back to school and study textiles. But before I made that decision, I actually interviewed people in the industry. I spent about a year, I had a year of sabbatical or unemployment, basically, having been laid off from a silver mill in New England, at Toll Silversmiths up in Newburyport, because they were shutting down. And I took that year to investigate the industry. I spoke with hand weavers, I spoke with production hand weavers and artistic hand weavers, weavers who wove for industry, with people in the industry, because I never really thought, so I think I've heard this from other people, that you actually can have a job in the textile industry. It's like, just never dawned on me, like, where does this stuff come from? So after that, and the advice I was given was, you really need, if you're going to weave at a level that you can get brought, you have to jump into the industry, you have to learn to weave and you have to learn to design. So that led me back to going to school. And I ended up at RISD, not knowing that RISD was what RISD is. It's just that they had the best textile program for me, that they blended both design and fine arts in the same program. And they had weaving. So that's how I ended up there. And spent 2 years, year and a half in the undergrad, because I already had that. And then the graduate program started. So I had applied for the first graduate program class and I was accepted. And so I spent an additional 2 years. So it was there total 3.5 years. And I came out with a degree in weaving. But while I was there, I also stumbled upon new weave construction, which played into what happened with my career later. So, for which I then applied for a patent and was awarded a patent. But after leaving RISD, because of my product design background, understanding a little bit more about industry, sort of traditional industries, not just automotive, I was hired by Milliken to work in their automotive product line. And I moved to the South to design for truck interiors. So it was flat woven. And it really, it didn't last in the South. It just was, I felt very, very remote town where I was. It was Abbeville, South Carolina. It was a very remote town. The exposure at Milliken was amazing because it was, many ways there were vertical mills. But the dyeing was in-house, the design work was in-house, finishing was in-house. So I was exposed to a lot of technology very cutting edge technology too, because Milliken was so big. They were also needing to produce for this extremely demanding field where you had to pass all kinds of testing for like fastness and sturdiness and seam testing and so forth. They even had what was called the mink test, which was some auto executive whose wife had gotten into a car and came out, slid out of the car and found a couple of hairs of her mink coat stuck in the fabric. And so the weave had to be tighter so no mink hairs would get caught in the fabric. That's how extreme it was. And the other funny part there was the color ranges. I mean, in school, we had freedom of color. And there, I remember the first meeting, everybody was talking about the color. We have to get, is this too much color? And I'm thinking, are they like spoofing me? Because everything on the table was gray and beige because it had to match the auto interiors. And there again, that was like a lesson in like accuracy, visual accuracy for color, because you had to match your fabric to the plastic, to the metal, to the paint. Everything had to be seamlessly the same color. So there was a lot of learning there. It was very good. And that got me up to Detroit, Michigan. I'd never been there because we had to meet with the automakers. So I learned about that world of the automakers, which was totally foreign to me, very interesting. But as I said, I just couldn't stay in South Carolina. It was culturally just a little bit too isolating for me. If I'd been younger, so I was already in my 30s at that point. If I'd been younger, I may have been able to like assimilate better with a lot of the younger peers and my working peers. But at that point, I was like, this is not where I want to be. So I came back north and ended up working for a mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, also doing automotive. And that was good too. I mean, I worked between there and Fall River. So Joan Fabric had their automotive business headquarters and design center up in Lowell, but we did the weaving in Fall River at Main Street. So I was traveling between those two plants. I'd say there was I had less integration with the actual manufacturing as I had in Milliken. In Milliken, we were out on the floor. We were working with the dye house. There was just so much technology we were exposed to. So, and the reason I left Joan was because my patent came through. And I really felt that there would be conflict of interest within the industry. So I left, and I also was offered a residency up in Michigan at a no longer existing creativity retreat. So I spent a summer there, kind of retraining myself to be a studio artist, to see if and developing artwork for my technique that I was hoping to eventually develop into a line of fabric. So I did do some freelance work at the time for non-competing industry. So it was in textiles, but it wasn't mills. So I did some painting of Oriental rugs, sort of cartoons for them to follow, and other decorative things. I did some freelance work for a mill down south, doing pattern painting, and slowly was trying to get my own business going, which was difficult because I had a brand new material that people really didn't know what to do with. It took me about 7 years to do that. But as that was happening, the mills in New England started disappearing and closing. So even opportunities to do freelance work was disappearing. I did some freelance work for Quaker for a while there too, but it just like all just dissipated. So around 1998, it was gone. And my own small business was starting to take hold. It took me about 7 years for someone to find interest in it, but I finally got someone a mill down south was willing to produce my fabric under licensing agreement. And so I was in that. So I still was in the textile industry, but kind of peripherally, because I was working isolated in my own studio with the licensing agreement, but the licensing agreement really didn't afford a close kind of working relationship with the mill. It just, they did it. I got the royalties, and that was it. So I had to find other ways to make a living because I wasn't quite paying the bills. So then I ended up finding myself in the arts admin world, working for the Rhode Island Foundation for almost 10 years, which was phenomenal because it exposed me to the art world, design world, seeing how the fine art world is working much more so than commercial world. But again, it sort of was one foot in there and one foot tentatively in the textile industry. So I was at the foundation till 2010, When during the economic downturn in general, I was laid off. And I took that as my opportunity to really push hard on getting my business with my woven animation fabric uh, into the market, and spent a little time figuring out what markets I want to go to, and kind of leaning back to my automotive days. I thought, well, there are already so many people filling the furniture market and the fashion market and so forth, but there's this world of transportation. So I looked into the high end. Well, first I just started looking at like, oh, well, commercial airlines, and then talking with people, and they're like, well, no, you don't want to do commercial airlines. First of all, it takes like 10 years to get a fabric developed for a plane, to get it through all the testing and fire retardancy and so on and so forth. What you want to be looking at are private airplanes. So what I thought would make my fabric stand out in the transportation industry is that it has a built-in structure that allows two images to be visible, woven into the fabric. So there's the integrity of the design within the fabric. It's not applied afterwards and so forth. And depending on which angle you look at the fabric, the patterns change. And I have control over what patterns I put into that. So I started to look at the airline industry, what would work, what wouldn't work, taking into consideration how much movement do you want in a fabric when you're already flying? What is this industry of private aircraft world? And I started going to some aircraft trade shows, which was fantastic, just to learn about that industry, and then connected with that industry, because now we're talking about luxury transportation. I was encouraged to also look at the mega yacht industry, super yacht, mega yacht industry, which I really had no idea what that was. To me, a yacht was a yacht. No, no, no. And that industry, pretty much the building at that time, which was around 2010, 2012, that industry really was wholly located in Europe. So I started going to Europe to trade shows in the super yacht industry, which was again, a stratosphere I had never been in. Very interesting world. Just the whole yachting world was interesting. Who the people were in that world, a lot of them had come out of the Navy. So there was a different culture there. Incredible wealth. I mean, wealth beyond wealth, both in European numbers. People from Saudi Arabia, a lot of Russian money at that time in the yacht industry is one way to kind of filter funds. And so I learned about cultures too. Like the Asian market was very different because of the way they entertain. They're now kind of catching up on the super yacht industry, but at the time it was less so. It was more the Europeans, Middle East, and the Russians. So that was going swimmingly. We were moving ahead, and then I had a sort of internal conundrum in my business, and I had to move out of my office, and it kind of threw me off. There were also some personal things going on with my family, and yeah, I stumbled. But I had already developed some fabric. I had a mill producing here in the U.S. I had product. I had production, and the next step would have been to get out there and start selling. And then things kind of halted for a while, and then once I was back on my feet, the pandemic hit, and everything stopped. And I probably could have pursued in a very aggressive way, trying to keep selling in that world, because that world didn't stop, but my funding wasn't there. So I wasn't able to make that leap. And I was working alone. I moved my office back home. So it was a very kind of insular experience. And so the pandemic was really when I switched over to producing artwork, fine artwork. I had just prior to that, I had spent a year and a half at the local college in Wheaton College up in Massachusetts. They had acquired a jacquard loom, and I was hoping to develop more fine artwork of my woven animation of this two directional fabric on their loom, but the loom never worked correctly. So I did the drawings, I did sampling, but I never was actually able to produce pieces, which was sad and frustrating. But while I was there, I had this beautiful space to work in. They called it the fiber space. This huge room, lots of light. And while I was there, there was a group of women who would come together at lunchtime from time to time to knit. There were staff and faculty on campus. And I kind of get to know them. I knitted with them a little bit. And I started playing around with this crochet idea. And this again goes back to my origins of being really interested in structure and product and objects. I developed this combination of weaves for crochet that would enable me to make sculptural pieces. So it took some trial. I was playing around with yarns, seeing if yarn types, like I had a shrinking yarn, would that work? And then I hit upon this 2-stitch combination that created a very kind of stable fabric in crochet. And then, so these were the kind of forms I started developing that really sustain themselves. This part is lace here on this piece, but generally this is very stable. It's a strong, self-standing piece. And that launched a series of work that I continued to work on through the pandemic. And oftentimes people say, "Oh, where was your studio that you worked in this?" I said, "My couch. My couch was my studio for 3 years, for 2 years through the pandemic." And it also interesting. So contacts that I had made through the textile industry and some schooling. So a group of women got together. There were 8 of us, and we got together through the pandemic. It was a way to stay in touch. It was a way to talk about textiles, to talk about our lives. A number of us were also caring for our elderly parents at that time. And we would meet once a month on Zoom to talk about our work, and also had a goal of putting together a group show. So that really was the stimulus for producing this serious, seriously putting a series of work together. It wasn't just, I'll work on this today or I'll work on that today. It was like, no, I need to produce 8 pieces of work in the next 6 months. And it was great. It was really, really great. And it opened up, it was surprising. I was like, where is this coming from? I'd never done this type of work before in a conscious way, like really consciously saying, no, this is going to be work that has a purpose and meaning and a craft to it. So yeah, so that's how I ended up there. So in talking with these women, they had experienced various levels of the industry dying out from under them. In some cases, they left on their own to start other businesses, but in most cases, the industry had disappeared. So my experience was a little different in that I kind of sidelined the industry as an employee, but I was still in it. But I also watched options for production of my work disappearing too. So that is still something I'm grappling with, because I do have 2 mills producing my work. One that still produces the work for the office interiors, for which I get royalties. The other that was producing the work for the aircraft industry and the yachting industry. But I don't know if I can do that anymore. It's too much time now has passed since I was sort of on that tipping point. And now I don't know if I have it in me anymore to do it. And I don't know if the mill would want to produce it. And I think there's smarter ways for me to still get the work done and not have to do it all myself. I mean, I jumped into this really not knowing what producing a line of fabric and trying to market it and sell it and everything, and test it too, because everything had to be tested to very high standards of functional standards in the industry, fire retardancy, strength, because this fabric was going to be used a lot. So we'll see where that goes. I'm not ready to give up on it being produced, but I think I'm going to approach it in a different way and see if I can find industry segments that would be interested in helping me produce it, or I can license the technology patent. I've been able to get a second patent on an advancement of the original technology. So the patent is still alive on the original and the second one. So I can still use that as intellectual property to try and license out to folks. So that's where I stand right now. It's kind of at a crossroad, but with a direction.